There's a guy who was an artist who introduced me to this workflow, which is an artistic workflow, and it applies really nicely to photography. And it's in three stages: tone, color, and special effects. And so if you think of that as your three steps in your workflow, you first apply the tone to your image, then you apply the color to the image, and then you apply the special effects to the image at the end. And the reason you do it in that order is because if you do the color first, then that affects the tones much more than if you do the tone first. If you do the tone first, and when you start to play with the colors, it will affect the tone a little bit, but nowhere near as much as if you do it the other way around. So rather than trying to chase your tail, it makes sense to get the tones right first, and then get the color right, and then all the special effects you do right at the end. So that's vignettes, color grading, sharpening, anything else that you do comes after all those other things. And if you do it in that order and you have that in your head, then all of a sudden your workflow becomes logical rather than jumping about, thinking, oh, I'm going to do this now, I'm going to do this now, put a vignette on, oh, no, that's a bit, and it starts to get too complex. So I'll just talk a little bit about colour and emotions. And I came across this the other day. There's lots of ways of looking at this. How you colour grade your photo will give you different effects depending on how you do it. So you can get a nice warm sunset, but if you shift the tint on it and make it blue, it gives you a morning, and it's a cool rather than a warm image, and you get different emotions out of it. So if you're going for a specific emotion in an image, then color grading using this sort of information is really, really valuable. That then leads me on to the color wheel. The color wheel for painting or drawing in the real world is a different color wheel from the color wheel that you use digitally. Because the color wheel digitally is red, green, and blue, because they were the three guns that fired electrons at the screen. Whereas we learn at school it's red, blue, and yellow. The red and yellow make orange, blue and yellow make green, blue and red make purple, and so on. So when you're mixing paints, it's slightly different. So when you're looking at the digital color wheel, you've got red, and the opposite is cyan, which is a sort of greeny blue color. You've got blue and yellow, whereas in the painting palette, the opposite of blue is orange. The whole thing's just tilted round slightly. And green and magenta. And what's really interesting with this is that magenta almost doesn't appear except in sunsets and things like that. It's not a very common color. So if you use it to color grade, it will give you often a very nice feel in small amounts. Green then becomes the highlight color. So if you alter the green in your image, you're basically altering the highlights in a color image. And most grass, if you try and fiddle with the sliders with grass, most of the color of grass is yellow. And if you play about with that, you find that out. Tints adding white to a color. You would do this with paint, and you do it digitally as well. So if you add white to it and make it lighter, that's tinting it. Whereas shading is adding black to a color. and that works the same with paints as it does digitally. This is this is the complementary color scheme, and you can move that round. So that's complementary, that's complementary, that's complementary, or anything in between. You can also move that in and out as well. So the color there and the color there are complementary, for example. So that's one way of looking at it. Another color scheme is the analogous color scheme, which is 3 colors. You've got your basic colors here and a color in between. So it takes the 2 colors in between. So you might have red, orangey red, and a sort of purpley color. As a way of mixing colours appropriately. So you can have an analogous colour scheme with the complement as well, and that will give you a slightly different feel. There's a tetradic colour scheme, which is using 1 each side on both sides. So you can use any of these balances, but the trick is really, if you understand the wheel and what's opposite and what's next to it, then that becomes really helpful in managing the colours in your image. And it's even more important for me because I'm colourblind, so I tend to have to know what's going on, so I don't make a colourful mistake, which I've done once or twice, at least. There's lots of different ways of doing this. This is the classic Photoshop colour wheel, which looks slightly different, but you can see that you've got all the colours around the outside, and you've got a middle sort of colour in the middle, and there's your shades going down to black. There's the tints going up to white, and the third one is saturation. So you've got this triangle of 3 different things which you can do to a colour to make it different. Where is that? It should be up here. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Now there's lots of different ways of looking at this. There's that way, there's that way, there's that way, there's that way, and they're all essentially saying the same thing. RGB sliders, window color, and
Yeah.
that brings the window up, and
Right.
And then there's 4 little lines, and you want
Right.
you want the color wheel there. You can see the buttons down here. There's HSB, RGB
Yep.
on one side. The other ones ignore for the time being.
Okay.
So these buttons down here alter what you see in the square.
Yeah.
So hue will give you a different color as you move the slider up and down. You see that?
All right.
Yep.
No.
Okay. If you click the next button down, which is S is saturation.
Yep.
Right? So you can change the saturation from no saturation at all to lots of saturation.
Yeah.
So we're still on blue. So if I push it there, and you can see now, if we're talking about the difference between tints and shades, if I go that way, I'm adding white. That's a tint. If I go downwards, I'm adding black. That's a shade.
Yeah.
Okay. And click the next one down is brightness, and essentially you can do the same thing there. So you can make it darker, or you can make it lighter. And that's all within the blues.
So the whole thing's all interconnected.
And so you can move about with this. I didn't really understand why this kept changing when I first started using Photoshop. When you change this, it all looks different. But that's hue. That's changing the color of the color. That's saturation. That's changing the saturation of the color, and that's changing the brightness of the color. Okay, so down at the bottom, there's some white text, and I want you to double click on that, and you should get a window up like that.
What-
These are the ideal settings. ProPhoto RGB, and that's the color space. Now, because you're exporting most of your images to JPEGs, that color space is sRGB, and sRGB fits inside ProPhoto RGB. So ProPhoto RGB has got more colors in it than sRGB has. So when you save it out as a JPEG in sRGB, your image will have less colors in it than the ProPhoto RGB. So what you're doing here is, at the moment, the image that I'm looking at on my screen isn't an image at all. It's just a data file, which is being interpreted by Camera Raw. And so what we're doing is telling it how to interpret it. Okay?
Mhm.
When it gets into Photoshop, it then becomes a pixel-based image. But at the moment, there's no pixels here. It's all just data. Okay? So ProPhoto RGB is best. 16 bits per channel depth. The reason for that is that the eye can see 10 bits per channel. So if you're using 8 bits per channel, then as soon as you start to fiddle, you get a degraded image. If you're using 16 bits per channel, when you start to fiddle, you've got 6 bits of image to degrade to before the eye can see a difference. Resolution 300 ppi if you're printing, but that number is only useful if you're printing. It depends on your printer. And the other one is open Photoshop as smart objects.
So that should be a default,
And that's your default setting.
right? Yeah.
And then you click on OK. And then at the bottom it should say ProPhoto RGB 60-bit, the size of the image, and 300 ppi, and that works. Now on the right hand side here, you can see a number of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And your order is going to be different to mine.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. If you want to change it, you can right click down and edit panels. And there's 3 sorts of modes: single mode, responsive panel mode, or multiple mode. I use single panel mode to open and shut them. If you click on edit panels to show, you can click on them and move them about by using the up and down keys.
Right.
Now, the reason I've got this set up in this way is because this is a logical workflow. You're starting off with the basic things, and then geometry, color mixer, curve, detail, color grading, effects. Optics I have set automatically to recognize the camera and apply profile corrections automatically. So that really doesn't even need to be there. And then calibration, you can use to calibrate it, the colors before you start. I don't really use that very much because that depends on your camera. If your camera always has a blue or a magenta cast to it, you can alter that automatically to take that away there. But essentially, the basic color settings, followed by geometry, because I do a lot of architecture stuff, colors, first and then curves. So to start off with this, when you look at this, this is everything that Lightroom does and more. So anything you can do in Lightroom, you can do here. And although it looks slightly different, it's essentially doing exactly the same thing. And the only difference is that the whole thing becomes much more logical, because then you can then move into Photoshop as well. So I'm starting off in the basic panel, which is the top one for me. I'm going to click on Auto. And Auto is now quite good because it generally tends to recognize what the image is and apply some good starter settings. It's not perfect, but it's a good place to start. And it's what it was saying here is that my image was a little bit overexposed, needed a bit more contrast, needed the whites pushing up and the blacks pushing down a bit, and it's pushed the vibrance up a bit and reduced the saturation. You can see these two little boxes up here tell you if you're clipping.
Nothing's come. So that must be new then.
No,
Basic. Basic. Yeah, sorry, I was a step behind. I'm there. Yep.
Yeah. So these the clipping warning, so it shows where the highlights are clipping. So if I click that on and off, you can see the blue appearing. If I push the black down further, you can see much more of it. So that's telling me that where the blue color is, that's pure black. And if I push the whites up,
oh, it's all gone blue.
It's all gone red, and where it's red, it's telling me that it's pure white. So if I wanted to have the sky completely white, I could do that, but it's changing everything. So these are sometimes switched on and sometimes switched off. They're best at this level being switched on, so you can see what's happening. I'll just bring that back a bit. Now I'm going to white balance this, and then I'm going to color balance it. So the first thing to do, there's lots of ways of doing white balance, but what I want to get out of this to go into Photoshop is a flattish image with the whole range of tones in the pixel image. Now I could completely process this in Camera Raw and save it as a JPEG out of it, and I could do the whole workflow in here. But if I want to do fancy things like put a focus in a certain place or convert it to black and white or something like that, then I'm going to want to use Photoshop for that. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start off with blacks, then go to white, shadows, highlights, contrast, and exposure. So I'm going to go from the bottom up, and I'm going to hold down the Alt or Option key, and as I move the black, you can see where it was blue, it's now gone black and white. So that's the black's burnt out. If I move that slider up to just about there, there are now almost no blacks in that. So I've got the bottom end of my tonal range. Okay, so that's in RGB terms, that's 0 red, 0 green, 0 blue. I'm going to then hold down the Alt or Option key again and do the same with the whites. You can see that there, that's blown out. I pull that back down to, I'm just going to get rid of all of those. And now there's no whites in that image at all. So that's 255, 255, 255. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So now if I look at my histogram, the blacks here, there's nothing burnt out here, and the whites, there's nothing burnt out here. Then I'm going to adjust the shadows so that I can see what's in the shadows. So push those up. And I'm going to adjust the highlights so that I get a nice balance. I'm not going to change the contrast here. Texture, clarity and dehaze. Texture will increase the texture of the grass and often will make it look a bit garish. Sometimes it's useful. What clarity does is it increases the contrast in the mid-tones. So if I push that up, it looks like sharpening. Sharpening is slightly different. And you can see it produces sort of HDR-ish effect almost. So sometimes using a little bit of clarity at this point is a good idea. And then dehaze will take the haziness out of the picture. But as you see, as it's doing that, it's actually altering the exposure as well if you push it too far. If you want to create a foggy day picture, you can reduce the dehaze. So if I'm going to increase that a little bit, and you might then want just to increase the exposure a bit as well to compensate for that. Yeah, and you can always check your blacks and your whites again just to make sure that they haven't moved. Okay. So that's auto, blacks using the Alt key, whites using the Alt key, shadows and highlights, and then a little bit of this if you're going to usually that the saturation, the vibrance works out. Usually I'll just pull that back a bit. Too. So the only other thing that's wrong here is the horizon. So I'm just going to fix that. And you can do that by clicking on this tool here and just draw the line along the horizon. And that's it straight now. That's quite a handy way of doing it at an early stage. So down here, you've got some other tools. You've got the crop tool. I tend not to do cropping here because here you've got a 3x3 grid, so it gives you the rule of thirds. But what it doesn't do is give you the other things like magic angles and Fibonacci sequences and things like that. So I tend not to use it here unless I know exactly what I want to do. You've got a healing brush tool, and I tend not to use it the healing brush in Camera Raw because if you're doing quite a lot, it starts to get quite slow. So I tend to reserve that for Photoshop, and I do that on its own layer. But what it is quite good for is taking out dust spots. And so if you click on the visualize spots, you can push, and you can see I've got almost clean image here.
Where is visualize spots?
I've got a dust spot here. You can adjust this to see what size spots you want to see and so on. But here's the spot. So I'm just going to make my brush bigger. I'm just going to click on that. And you can see how it's chosen an area next to it and made the spot disappear. If I take the overlay off and I take the visualize spots off, you can see that there's nothing there. Put the overlay back on. Just vaguely see the spot there. But if I take it away now, as I'm doing the processing in Photoshop, it won't appear. So it's quite a good time to do dust spots just at the moment. So there's an adjustment brush, very rarely use that. Graduated filters, very rarely use that. Graduated filters, all of these things you can do in Photoshop better.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah.
My picture has still got, whether you can see it, a big white spot in the middle of the sun.
Yeah.
How do I on it? But it's not, when I was moving the whites, it didn't disappear.
That's because it's completely burnt out. They're white pixels on your image.
Right, okay.
You'll get about 2 stops back in Camera Raw.
Yeah.
What you're doing is you're manipulating the data.
Mhm.
If you look at you see the profile thing up here,
Yeah,
that's the data manipulation that you're using.
right.
So I could use the Adobe Landscape data manipulation. See how it's changed the colors.
Oh yeah.
So that's applying how the data is interpreted before you get to any of these effects.
Yeah.
Or Adobe Standard. See, that's a bit washed out looking. Adobe Vivid, that's going to be quite bright. If you click on the little boxes next to it, there's a whole load of stuff here, and you can see previews of what they'll
Right.
look like. Artistic ones, or modern coloured ones, or vintage ones, all sorts of things. Black and white ones are quite useful, but not at this point normally. And once you choose one, you can adjust the amount that it applies it to it.
Oh, that's right.
So I'm going to go back to just the color one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's manipulating the data before it's even got to pixels.
Yeah.
Geometry is quite useful if you've got buildings where the lines are converging in and you want to make them straight. And I prefer this to the Photoshop one, so I tend to do this at the beginning if I'm going to do it on the raw data, so that by the time it gets to Photoshop, the raw data is converted into pixels. Whereas if I try and do it in Photoshop, I'm moving pixels around, but it says I'm not moving pixels, I'm moving data. So it's not going to degrade the image. The color mixer will allow you to adjust the colors if you've got a color cast particularly. So if I wanted to make the greens a little bit less saturated, I could push that down. If I wanted to make them a bit darker, I could click on the luminance and push the luminance down. See how it's making the green colors darker. Push the yellows down to do it even more. That's because grass is yellow. Take the saturation and so that's a much more natural looking green, I think, isn't it? There's curves here which you can use. Generally don't, because I'm doing that in Photoshop. Sharpening I tend not to do at this point, but I do tend to come back to use sharpening in Camera Raw at the end. Effects like vignettes I'm not going to use at this stage. So let's open this as an object now, and if we open this as a smart object, it means that if we don't like what we've done, we can go back to Camera Raw and change it. So here I am now in Photoshop. Yeah. So what do I want to do with this image? I think the first thing I might want to do is crop it. There's quite a nice empty space there, but I'm going to do something for the sake of it here, really. So I clicked on the crop tool. Once I've got a grid up, which I can do just by touching the edge, if I press O on the keyboard, I get a grid. If I press O again, I get some diagonals. If I press O again, I get that sort of diagonal.
Are they on the thirds?
If I press again, that's the magic square. If I press it again, I get the Fibonacci thing. And so it allows you to cycle through those. And I can say, well, okay, if I'm going to put that on the third a bit more, I can pull this in a bit this way. And that's looking a bit nice. And I'll take the top of that to a third. And I can press O and work through those.
Because it's a smart object, you're not losing your pixels, are you?
And not unless you click delete crop pixels.
Right.
If you delete crop pixels, then it will chop them off.
Yeah, and that's you lose it then, don't you, from your
Then-
image?
Then you lose it.
Yeah.
The other thing that you can do is use content aware fill.
Right.
But you can't do that at the moment on a smart object. So if I duplicate that
Yeah.
and rasterize it, so it's not a smart object anymore. Now I can use content
You can
aware.
do it on
So
the layer.
if I click on that and I want to drag this out further than the images I've got, it will fill the spacing for me.
Yeah. And stretch it over.
There you are.
Yeah. Fab.
So what did you do? Can you go through that again, please?
Yeah. So I'm not using a smart object layer here.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't work on smart objects. I'm
Right.
going on to the crop tool. I'm using content aware. I'm going to stretch out the image
Yeah.
beyond image that I've got.
Yeah.
There's nothing there. And I'm going to say, fill that in for me, Photoshop, with something that looks right by
Mhm.
clicking that button there.
Yeah.
And then it'll think for a bit. So what you've done is you've increased the canvas size and used content aware fill. And you see, that's actually made quite a good job of that, hasn't it?
It has. Yeah. That's also good.
It often works really well. If you've got repeated things, you can always clone them out.
So did you have to make a copy of your layer to
Yeah.
do that? Yeah,
I did.
yeah.
Right. So you make a layer.
You duplicate the layer. Not,
I
not
du-
make
I
a new layer.
Duplicate
The layer.
the layer
Yeah.
because
Ah, yes. Content aware is now there.
content, if it's a smart object, it won't work. So you've got to stop it being a smart object, that layer,
Yeah.
by rasterizing it. And then content aware becomes available.
Mhm.
It's useful for doing stretching borders on when you've done like a portrait, isn't it? And you've got a messy background.
Wow. That's really good. It's
Mm.
just, I've just made more confront a bit wider.
Yeah. It's cool, isn't it?
Yeah. That's really good.
Okay, so I'll crop this now. I'm happy with that. What else could I do with it? What else am I going to do this one? I'm going to think about tones and colours again, and think about what I might want to do with this. Let's get up a curves layer. So with the curves adjustment layer, I can alter the highlights, midtones and shadows. One easy way of getting control over it, because it's a very sensitive tool, is to put a click there, there, and there. So I've got, there's my shadows, there's my midtones, there's my highlights. So each of these I can adjust by pushing diagonally. So I'm increasing the midtones there, decreasing the midtones there. It's very, very sensitive. You don't need to do very much. So I'm going to make the shadows a bit darker. I'm going to make the highlights a bit brighter. Let's see what happens with the midtones. Just take the midtones down a little bit. So if I can do the before and after. See how that's made a difference?
Mm.
No.
It's subtle, but I've altered the tones without altering the colours. If you highlight one of the points, you can use the arrow keys to move it about, which is a bit easier sometimes. I'm happy with those tones now. I'm not quite sure I'm happy with the colours. But before I do that, it's a very boring sky, isn't it? And I can choose
Like,
any number of skies, either the ones that are already in there from Photoshop, or I can add my own in by adding them in from here or looking in the file. So I could go to, I could go and search my files, and I can have them in here permanently if I want to. I'm going to say choose that sky instead. It's not very good, is it?
oh, that makes a lot of difference, doesn't it?
It does. It's not right there.
No, I know, but it does look a lot better.
That's a better one. Let's use that one.
Does the software know that that's a sky? Because my sky replacement's blanked out.
Are you on your curves layer?
Yeah,
Yeah, you need to be on the image layer.
okay, yeah,
There's no sky on the curves layer because it's an adjustment layer.
yeah, okay,
Okay.
yeah.
So let's choose that sky. I've got some ways of juggling this about a bit to make it a bit different. Take the brightness down. So if you look at what it's actually done, it's added some foreground lighting and added the sky. See, it's masked out the thing. So because these are all in separate layers, I can just, if I want to, I can just reduce the opacity of that. And make it
Oh, that's brilliant.
much less obvious. And see what foreground lighting does. I don't really want so much foreground lighting, so let's.
Oh, that's nice.
And so that's given me just a bit more of an interesting sky, hasn't it?
Mhm.
That's really an artistic effect. But I'm putting it in before the colour, before the tone and the colour, because I'm actually creating a bit more of an image there. So now I'm going to just have another think about the colours now. I've got all that sorted out. I'm going to use a hue saturation layer, which is that one. So you can change globally what's going on, but I've already done my tone, so I don't really want to do that. But I can interfere with the individual colours here. So I've got red, yellows, green, cyan, blues, and magentas. So if I choose the reds, there's probably, if I move the lightness up and down, there's no reds in there, but there's some yellows, and I'm adjusting the lightness of the grass. So let me take the grass down a bit and maybe increase the saturation a little bit. So if I do the before and after, got in one place, before and after, that's before. That's after. Subtle change. If I push the right button. Just increase the saturation of the yellows a bit. So, what's the complementary colour to yellow? From the
Blue.
colour wheel?
Blue.
Blue, yeah. So if I've altered the yellow to make it a bit more yellow, complementary colour to that is going to be blue. So let's go for blues and see what we can do with that. So let's increase the saturation of the blues and see what we can do with them. So that there we've got a bit of a better balance. We're moving from what was a fairly bland image into something that's looking a lot nicer. Right, so that's my tones and my colours done. That's the tones, that's the colours. So I'm thinking about the artistic effects now. So this is where the focus of the image is, but it doesn't really jump out at the moment, does it? What I'd like to do is give that a bit of extra punch. So let's go to a gradient layer. That's more like it. I'll double click on that. And I want radial. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. Now, I've got a black blob there, and while this box is open and the gradient fill there, I can move it about. So I can place it there. But that's not the right color, is it? I don't want it to be black. So if I click on this, I can get the gradient panel up, and I want to change this color from black to a nice sort of yellowy color. That's better. I'm going to change the tint on that, make it a bit lighter. So I'm putting a highlight on this. It's way too strong at the moment. I'm going to change the blending load to the hard mix burn mode. And that was horrible, wasn't it? But if I take the fill down, and just won't take up to about less than 20, 30. See what happens?
Mm.
Mm,
That suddenly becomes the focus of attention, isn't it?
yeah.
And what I've done essentially is colorize the colors a little bit with a little sort of pale yellow wash. And just a bit, the color isn't right. It needs to be a bit lighter than that, I think. Better. Yeah, I think it only needs to be subtle. Before, after. Now there you go. That's not looking quite so bad now, is it?
No.
It's looking a little bit interesting. Although this seems to be quite advanced, it just teaches you lots of principles, really.
Yeah.
And then you can, once you get confident doing this, then you can apply them to other things.
Yeah.
Any layer, you can change the name of it, and I would strongly recommend that as you go through it, you make it so that you understand. You're describing what you've done in the title, and organize your files. So I can now turn that on and off. See?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm now looking at this and I think I quite like this here, but I don't like this bit on the C.
Mm.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my stone by using select subject. There we are, done it for me.
Mm.
Okay, now I'm going to use this group that I've made here, and I'm going to click on the mask icon. Okay, and I've created a mask now, which is just the subject.
Yeah.
And then I quite like it on the grass though, to a certain extent. So I'm going to get a black brush, a white brush, soft white brush. Reduce the opacity a bit, make it a bit bigger. I'm just going to paint that back in. There we are. So that's just a quick way of selecting around where I wanted to select. Then finally, I think it might be quite nice to have a bit of a vignette around this, but not necessarily a round one. So how about a square one? Going to create a new layer. And I'm going to choose the gradient tool, and I want it foreground to transparent, so it's black. And I'm going to just create a little bit of a gradient around the outside. Now, if I just do that, it moves around all over the place, and it doesn't necessarily give me what I want, and I also want it to be linear. So if I hold down Shift, it gives me a straight line of 45 degrees or 90 degrees. Makes it much easier.
Mm.
So do that, do that, do that, do that.
Wow.
That looks horrible. Let's change the blend mode to multiply. And what multiply does is it darkens the darks. And I'm going to take the opacity down just so you can just about see it.
Crikey.
Before and after. Let's finish off with a bit of blend if. The blend if is really helpful. So what I've done is I've double clicked on the layer here, and I get this box up. This is the layer styles. Now, this allows you to protect certain areas. So if I want to protect the highlights from this, I can move this down. And you see it's all gone. I'll bring it back. You see you see how the highlights are appearing?
Mm.
Because I'm protecting them. Now that looks a bit gross, but if I press Alt or Option, I can split this, and it's much more subtle. See that?
Mm.
So I'm protecting the highlights to the midtones in the layer underneath. So I can click OK there. Then I've got that on multiplied. Then I'll reduce the opacity, and it gives me a very subtle effect. Not enough to see, but enough to just take your eye into the middle. So the final thing I'm going to do before I output this is to sharpen it. There's loads and loads of ways to do sharpening. But the easiest one is to use Camera Raw. It's got a really good sharpening tool in it, and you can do that in a non-destructive way. So I want to create a stamp of the whole stack, and I'm going to do that by pressing Command, Option, Shift, and E, or there'll be Control, Alt, Shift, and E, and you should end up with a new layer. So now you've got a stamp of all the layers. If you turn it off, nothing changes because you've got one pixel layer, which is all the other layers. So let's convert that into a smart object. Right click, convert to smart object.
Smart object.
Which means that we can then go back and change it if we need to.
Right.
There you go. So you get the little icon to say it's a smart object.
Mm.
Because that's a smart object, I can go into Camera Raw and again and use it Camera Raw as a filter. So filter, Camera Raw filter. While we're in Camera Raw as a filter, this isn't a raw image anymore. This is a pixel image. So the effects aren't going to be quite the same. So when you're doing it from a stamp layer at the top, this is a pixel image. If you do it from the layer at the beginning that you went into, that you started with, then you're going back to the raw file.
Right.
But when you're doing it this at the end like this isn't a raw file. This is a pixel file. But still, you can still use the same tools, and some of these tools are quite nice. So the detail, for example, will give you sharpening and noise reduction and so on. So let's do a bit of sharpening. So if you move the sharpening up like that, you can see
Wow.
Detail.
how the detail bounces out.
Mm.
You see that? But I don't want to sharpen the whole image. All I
No.
want to do really is sharpen this bit here. I certainly don't want to be sharpening the sky and the sea. That makes no sense at all because I want that to be blurry. So I'm going to use the masking tool. So I'm going to hold down the Option key. And as I move the masking tool, you'll see something similar to when we were using black and white earlier on. As I push this down, all the stuff that's going black isn't going to be sharpened now.
Which is the Option key in Windows?
Alt.
Alt key, right, yeah.
So now I'm sharpening the grass, the rock, and nothing much else. Is that what yours looks like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, click the little arrow by the side. There's a triangle.
Oh, bloody hell. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got it.
Hooray. So
Yeah.
work it so that you're masking out the big areas that you don't want to sharpen. All I want to sharpen really here is the stone and the stuff underneath it, and maybe a bit of the grass around. But it's sharpening all the grass at the moment. Well, that's okay. I can take my radius right down. The radius for most of the time is not going to be more than 1 pixel. So what the radius is how much either side of an area of contrast does Camera Raw change the contrast. So this is working on areas of different contrast. So say the edge of the stone, for example. If we go right in there, there's an area of contrast there. So the radius is best kept. This is quite a large image, so my radius could be down to about half a pixel. And then you can push the sharpening up quite hard without getting any haloing at all.
So that's how you get rid of halos around things.
Well,
One of the ways.
well, you don't over sharpen, so you don't have a big radius on your sharpening.
Yeah.
So when you're doing sharpening, you want to be in at about 100%. So that sort of level, or maybe a bit more for a big image.
Mhm.
And then you can see how much effect you're having. And that looks okay to me. That looks too much, it's too crunchy. And again, it needs to be subtle. And you can use the on and off button to see the before and after. You probably can't see that over zoom. And so that's my sharpening done. Okay, once you've done that, click OK. Right. Now let's change that. If you want to go, if you look at it, maybe don't like that. I want to go back. You can go back into it and change it again, because here you've got the Camera Raw filter to just click on, and just click on that. And it takes you back to exactly where you were before.
Ah.
And you can change again. So although you created a new layer, what you've done to it is non-destructive. So we've got now 2 images. We've got our image with all this lot, and then we've got the final image, which is sharpened. I've masked out all the sky, and I've masked out all the areas of low contrast. But actually, I don't want all this to be sharp as well. So I can create a mask. So I'm going to create a mask. I'm going to get a big black brush on 100%. I'm going to paint in around here. Right, whoops. Or I don't want it sharpened. I'm going to keep the edge sharpened. I don't want that. There we go. So now we excluded this bit in the masking in Camera Raw. We've now excluded this bit, and so that the only thing that's been sharpened, so I've blacked out all that, but I've got my unsharpened image underneath. So now, in effect, all I'm really sharpening is the edge along here and this. You know, if you can see the difference there. So I'm going to save this now as a Photoshop